Picture this, 150 of America's best, paratroopers with jungle mud on their boots, radios on their backs, and the full weight of a superpower behind them, helicopters chopping the sky into ribbons, artillery crews hunched over firing tables, napalm stacked like orange prayers on the flight line, maps stamped secret, briefings full of confident arrows, and then nothing. 3 days of thunder and rotor wash and burning fuel. 3 days of marching through a green wall that swallowed light, sound, and certainty. 3 days of booby traps, punji stakes, and invisible gunfire that seemed to come from the trees themselves. 12 casualties without seeing a single enemy face. 2 Hueys limping home with bullet holes that looked like little mocking eyes. Total failure. Now zoom in tighter. The American intelligence captain, seasoned, sharp, not easily shaken, sits in a cramped Australian tent in Phuoc Tuy province, November 1967. The air inside is wet enough to drink. Sweat runs down his spine like a slow verdict. Outside, the jungle hums. Inside, the silence feels informed. Across the table are 5 Australian SAS operators. 5, not 50, not a battalion. 5 men with lean packs and calm faces, like they've been living in the shadow of this jungle for weeks, and it never once raised its voice at them. The American captain is still trying to keep his dignity intact when an Australian sergeant reaches into his rucksack and tosses a battered field notebook onto the table. Not ceremoniously, not like it's sacred, like it's a tool, like a hammer or a can opener. The notebook lands with a soft, dull thud, as if even paper knows better than to make noise here. The American captain flips it open, and his blood runs cold, because the pages aren't filled with bravado. They're filled with the jungle's secrets. Neat, ruthless entries, coordinates, times, routes, names. 17 enemy positions marked with the casual precision of a man listing groceries, movement schedules for 3 Viet Cong companies, locations of 2 underground field hospitals, a rice pipeline, a courier pattern, 4 village chiefs identified as silent suppliers, men who smiled at American patrols and fed the communists at night. The American captain has aerial reconnaissance photos taken from 40,000 feet, RF-4 Phantoms, crystal clear images of nothing, an endless sea of canopy, a green lie. This notebook, it reads like someone walked under that canopy and found a hidden city. He swallows. He tries to keep his voice steady. How? The Australian sergeant doesn't answer right away. He just reaches back into the rucksack and pulls out a hand-drawn map, not a sketch, a world. Every trail, every stream, every footpath that doesn't show on American charts. Ambush sites, cache locations, water sources, places where the ground is soft enough for tunnels, places where the undergrowth is thin enough for a unit to move quietly, places where the vines hang low and will snag a careless soldier's web gear with a single, tiny metallic click. The American captain feels something worse than embarrassment. He feels hunted, because in that moment he understands the horrifying implication. If these 5 Australians can see this much, then the enemy can see them too. And if the enemy has been laughing at napalm and artillery and helicopter blades, it isn't because the enemy is brave, it's because the enemy can hear America coming from miles away. The Australian sergeant finally speaks, voice low, almost bored. "You're looking for them the way you'd look for an army," he says. "They're not an army, they're a shadow." The American captain stares at the map as if it might start moving. And this moment in the tent, this is the moment everything should have changed. But it didn't. Because what those pages contained wasn't just intelligence. It was an accusation against the entire American way of fighting this war. And the Pentagon would spend the next decades trying to bury the lesson under layers of classification, bureaucracy, and pride. They would call it a tactic, but it was more than that. It was a philosophy. It was the ghost strategy. And the Viet Cong feared it more than bombs. To understand how 5 men did what 150 couldn't, you have to start somewhere no American briefing ever started. Not Saigon, not Washington, not Fort Bragg, Western Australia, 1957. A place where the horizon isn't a line, it's a distance you have to earn. A place where heat isn't weather, it's pressure. A place where the earth doesn't forgive mistakes, it records them. That year, the Australian Army made a decision that looked strange on paper and revolutionary in hindsight. They selected a small group of soldiers and sent them not to a school, not to a range, not to a classroom, but into the outback with Aboriginal trackers. Men whose families had read land like language for tens of thousands of years. Men who didn't search for signs the way modern soldiers do. They listened to the ground the way you listen to a friend's voice. The Australians didn't treat it like a cultural tour. It wasn't survival training for weekends. It was immersion. Months of it. Brutal, humbling, relentless. They learned that the bush tells the truth if you stop shouting at it. A crushed grass blade can hold a timestamp. A scuffed pebble can point like a finger. A broken spiderweb can whisper, "Someone passed here," and they tried not to be seen. They learned to smell the faint chemical tang of processed food in a man's sweat. Not from inches away, from meters, sometimes dozens. They learned how to move through brush without disturbing it, not because it's quiet, but because disturbance is information. A snapped twig is a broadcast. A bent leaf is a signature. A dragged boot is a confession. They learned to become a question mark. And when those lessons were eventually formalized, codified by the Australian SAS by the early 1960s, they produced a doctrine that barely resembled Western military training. American special forces, brilliant in their own own right, trained to coordinate firepower, to call in airstrikes, to dominate the fight with technology and speed, to hit hard, loud, and fast. The Australians trained to do something far more unsettling. They trained to disappear. By the time Vietnam became a furnace that chewed up divisions and spit out statistics, the Australians arrived with a philosophy that didn't start with, how much force can we bring? It started with, how little can we leave behind? Americans brought presence. Australians brought absence. The American method in Vietnam was built on certainty. You move big, you move loud, you show strength, you sweep an area, you flush the enemy, you force contact, you win through volume. It worked against conventional armies. It made sense in World War II. It even had logic in Korea. But Vietnam wasn't a battlefield. It was a living, breathing disguise. In Vietnam, being heard was the same as being targeted, and American units were always heard. Helicopters announced themselves like thunder gods. Radios crackled every 30 minutes, sending little electric yelps into the ether. Cooking smoke rose into canopy gaps. Cigarette fumes, metal clinks, boot scuffs, the chemical cleanliness of Western soap and toothpaste, the scent of canned rations and nylon and machine oil. To a Viet Cong scout, an American patrol wasn't something to stumble into. It was something you could sense, like a storm approaching. So the enemy adapted. They didn't fight fair because fair doesn't exist in a jungle. They hid, they watched, they waited. They let Americans exhaust themselves chasing ghosts, and then they bled them with traps and small, precise violence. The Australians looked at this and did the opposite. They didn't want the enemy to know they were there. They wanted the enemy to suspect they were there. And in that gap between suspicion and certainty, fear grows teeth. 3 days before a patrol, Australian operators would begin stripping themselves of everything foreign. No soap, no toothpaste, no deodorant, no petroleum products, no shaving cream, nothing that smells like a modern bathroom. They'd start eating captured enemy rations, rice, fish sauce, whatever they could take, because even your diet changes the chemical story your body tells the air. They'd wash clothing in local river water, no detergent, rub themselves with crushed vegetation. Sometimes, depending on conditions, masks sent with mud, rot, even animal waste. Not because it's pleasant, because it works. Then they take their equipment apart the way a mechanic listens to an engine. Anything reflective, dulled, covered, painted, wrapped. Anything that rattles, tied down, taped, removed. Anything that squeaks, oiled carefully, or replaced. Anything unnatural, minimized. They weren't preparing for combat. They were preparing for invisibility. And once they entered the jungle, the discipline turned from uncomfortable to almost inhuman. Radio silence, not reduced chatter, silence, hand signals, touch cues, tiny movements the eye barely catches. In some patrols, men wouldn't speak a single word for days, 10 days, more, no coughs, no sneezes if you can help it, no clearing your throat. Because sound doesn't travel in the jungle like it does in movies. It doesn't echo. It threads itself through leaves, and someone down the trail feels it in their bones. Their movement was slow to the point of madness. Americans might cover 15 or 20 kilometers in a day, carving a path of broken undergrowth and boot prints. Australians might cover 2, sometimes 3, sometimes less, because they practiced a technique the Americans later called ghost walking. Each step placed as if the ground is a sleeping animal. Foot down softly, weight transferred only after you felt for a twig, a dry leaf, a hollow stick that would crack like a gunshot at night. When maximum stealth was required, they could take nearly a minute to move a single meter. That sounds absurd until you understand the truth. The jungle is not a racetrack, it is a sensor network, and the man who moves fastest is simply the man who leaves the clearest trail. At first, the Viet Cong didn't understand what was happening. Their systems worked beautifully against Americans. Informants in villages, scouts on trails, signal intercepts, listening posts. They could predict helicopter insertions, they could hear American columns, they could smell them. Then the Australians arrived and the system failed. Patrols went out, nothing happened, no contact, no sightings, no sign. Then suddenly, without warning, a Viet Cong unit would be struck with a precision that felt supernatural. A point man drops. Before anyone can even identify direction, another man drops. A third screams, but the scream is cut short. The unit returns fire into trees that hold no targets. They charge a direction and find only empty brush. Then silence again. The Australians were never seen because being seen wasn't part of their plan. They were a rumor that shot back. Captured documents and later interviews would describe the psychological rot this created. Viet Cong troops who had endured bombing raids, who had watched napalm turn tree lines into hell and still returned, began refusing to enter areas where Australian patrols were rumored to operate. They called the Australians Ma Rung, forest ghosts, jungle phantoms. And this wasn't admiration, it was dread. Because bombs are terrifying, yes, but bombs are also honest. You hear them, you see them, you know when they're coming and when they're gone. An enemy you cannot detect is something else entirely. It infects sleep, it poisons confidence, it turns the jungle itself into a traitor. Men would wake to find a sentry dead without a sound. Supply caches destroyed with clean, efficient charges. A tunnel entrance collapsed. A trail junction suddenly lethal. No footprints, no smoke, no evidence, only absence. And the more the Viet Cong tried to counter it, the worse it got. Because how do you prepare for a threat that doesn't announce itself? That's what the Americans didn't fully grasp in 1967. The Australians weren't just fighting bodies, they were strangling infrastructure. They weren't counting kills, they were counting broken arteries. A rice cache destroyed means hunger. A courier captured means silence across an entire network. A trail interdicted means weeks of rerouting and rebuilding. By the time the enemy realizes something is wrong, the damage has already been done. Now we come to the tactic that made the ghost strategy legendary, the spider's web ambush. Americans did ambushes the way you'd expect. Establish a kill zone, position a blocking force, wait for the enemy to walk into it, and then unleash controlled chaos. Effective, yes, but once the first shots are fired, the game changes. Surprise is spent. The enemy knows where you are, at least generally, and now you're a target. The Australians designed an ambush that didn't end when the first shot was fired. It began. A 5-man patrol would identify a trail network, a cluster of junctions the enemy used regularly. Then they'd set themselves like a web across several square kilometers. Not one kill zone, multiple. Not one firing position, several. When the enemy entered, the Australians wouldn't rush it. They watched. They waited. They let the enemy commit deeper into the web, like an insect crawling toward the center. Then, at the worst possible moment for the enemy, a single shot would drop the point man. Not a burst, not a spray, one shot. And before anyone could process what happened, the shooter was already moving, sliding back, vanishing into a secondary position. The enemy would surge toward where the shot came from and find nothing but jungle. Then a second shot, from an angle that makes no sense, drops someone else. The enemy panics. They try to flank, they try to pursue, they try to retreat. But the trails that felt familiar now feel cursed, because every decision pushes them into another thread of the web. It could last hours. A running battle where the Australians are never fixed, never pinned, never seen. The enemy bleeds and bleeds and bleeds, chased by an absence that keeps firing. There are documented engagements where tiny patrols hit forces 10 times their size, 20 times their size, inflicting devastating casualties while withdrawing untouched. Not because the Australians were superhuman, because they refused to become a target, and that's the part that unsettled American observers the most. Not the body counts, not the bravery, the implication that the loudest army on Earth was also the easiest to track. Back in that tent in November 1967, the American captain stares at the notebook as if it's a weapon pointed at him. Because in a way it is. It proves something that cannot be comfortably explained inside an American command structure obsessed with metrics. The Americans measure progress in photographs. Bodies lined up, territory swept, enemy contact. The Australians measure progress in empty rice caches and silent courier lines and trails that stop being used. One photographs well, the other wins quietly, and quiet victories are politically inconvenient, so the reports go up the chain and come back down stamped with words that kill truth. Classified, filed, not actionable, unsuitable for scale. Some American liaison officers embedded with Australians wrote memos that read like heresy. They said plainly that American doctrine was built for industrial war, factories and front lines and divisions, while Vietnam was an insurgency wrapped in jungle. Trying to defeat it with massive sweeps and strategic bombing was, as one observer put it, like trying to drain a swimming pool with a hammer. But by 1969, the war was a political wound. Commanders were pressured to show progress. Progress meant numbers. Numbers meant body counts. Body counts meant big operations with big explosions. A 5-man patrol controlling a province doesn't look like victory on television. 100 bodies does, even if the 100 bodies cost 50 American lives and changed nothing. So the ghost strategy became a rumor even inside Allied headquarters. A whispered thing officers referenced over maps late at night, then erased in daylight meetings. And yet, the truth has a habit of leaking through the cracks. Some American officers, hard men with scars and medals, noticed. They wrote about it. They tried, in small ways, to imitate it. They emphasized stealth. They punished careless noise. They taught men to move like hunters rather than machines. Some succeeded. Most got ignored. The institution was too heavy to turn quickly. Then came the tragedies that look inevitable only because people refused to learn. Large operations detected months in advance. Helicopters shot down. Units lured into prepared kill zones. Firepower applied like a blunt instrument while the enemy simply stepped aside and returned after the smoke cleared. Again and again, the same pattern. And always, somewhere in the background, the quiet alternative existed. Small teams, minimal signature, intelligence first, precision second, destruction last. But it took decades for the American military to truly absorb what the Australians were demonstrating in real time. In the late 1970s and 1980s, as special operations forces were reorganized and reimagined, the ghost strategy's DNA began appearing in training syllabi and doctrine. Smaller units, better reconnaissance, patience, stealth, intelligence-driven raids rather than sweeping marches. What was dismissed as unsuitable in 1968 became best practice later. But there was one aspect of the ghost strategy that remained controversial, then and now: the psychological warfare. The Australians understood something uncomfortable. In counterinsurgency, perception can kill faster than bullets. After ambushes, survivors would sometimes find signs that suggested something beyond human. Symbols carved into trees, equipment arranged in ways that echoed local folklore, bodies positioned to feed superstition, not random cruelty, calculated terror. And that's where the story stops being a clean lesson and becomes morally complicated. Some historians argue it reduced casualties by making enemy troops avoid certain regions. Others argue it crossed lines and deepened the brutalization that already infected the war. Even the Australians in many official histories speak carefully about it. Some files remain sealed. But effectiveness? That part isn't disputed. The Viet Cong feared silence more than bombs. Because bombs are a storm, silence is a predator. Now let's return to the tent. The American captain finally closes the notebook. His hands are steady, but his mind isn't. He looks up at the 5 men across from him. "You did all this," he says, voice strained, "with 5 The Australian sergeant shrugs just slightly. "We didn't do it," he says. "We watched it. We listened. The jungle tells you everything. You just have to stop yelling over it." The captain wants to argue, wants to defend his men, his doctrine, his country's method. He wants to say it's not that simple, but he can't, because 3 days of helicopters and artillery and napalm produced nothing but casualties. 3 weeks of 5 quiet men produced a map of the enemy's veins. In that single moment, the American captain understands a truth that will haunt him. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes, power is the ability to be nowhere until you decide to be everywhere. He writes his own report later. He chooses his words carefully, but the meaning is unmistakable. The Australians have found something America is not prepared to become. The report disappears into classification. Years later, decades later, when pieces of it resurface, historians will read lines that sound almost prophetic. The war will be lost, the mistakes will be repeated elsewhere, and the lesson will be relearned only after more blood is spent. And that is exactly what happens. The jungle grows back over the trails. The old patrol bases vanish under vines. The tunnels collapse. The villages change. The war becomes memorials and documentaries and arguments. But somewhere, in archives and yellowing binders, there are still pages, coordinates, times, notes written by men who moved like ghosts. And there is still that battered notebook, real or mythologized, sitting like an accusation in the mind of anyone who studies Vietnam seriously, because it asks a question that makes generals uncomfortable and soldiers furious. How did they do what we could not? The answer wasn't secret technology, it wasn't magic, it was older than empires. 40,000 years of tracking knowledge fused with modern discipline, a doctrine built around absence, a willingness to trade speed for invisibility, explosions for intelligence, noise for control. 5 men, 1 province, 3 weeks, 17 enemy positions, 0 casualties, numbers that should have changed everything. Instead, they changed almost nothing, not in time to matter for the war being fought, and that, more than any battle, more than any statistic, is the quiet tragedy that still echoes under the canopy. The road not taken was right there, silent, waiting, like a ghost in the jungle.